There are no handouts tonight. Just didn't have time to put anything together. So if there's some things in this presentation and probably for next week that I'll probably put together as a handout, and we'll have one next week. So, uh, I've been sharing a quote with you for the last several weeks from Dr. Fred Shea, and he had something on his devotional that he does every Friday that I get a copy of, and I thought this was good to kind of share, especially with all the stuff that we've been talking about the last several weeks. Something else to think about in 2023. He says, to realize the culture is confused is obvious. That's true. To recognize that the church is contaminated by the culture is tragic. And finally, to reluctantly acknowledge that Christians are conforming to the culture is heartbreaking. And that truly is. The culture is something that the church has been dealing with for 2,000 years, and it has a way of making its way into the church at various times. And I agree wholeheartedly with what he says in that last sentence. When Christians start conforming to the culture for whatever the reason might be, that's tragic. That's really heartbreaking. So, anyways, we are in Matthew 24, of course, and so if you have your Bibles, you can go ahead and open them up to Matthew 24, and get organized here. We are actually in the last section, dealing with the second coming of Christ in the, I guess it's the midpoint of Matthew 24. Christ is talking, of course, about the second coming. And we looked at verses 27 and 28 last week, and just to kind of refresh your memory, verse 27, these verses are from the New American Standard. It says, for just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. And we talked about that at length last week. Talked about Christ is saying, what it's going to be like when he returns. And that we talked about the idea of lightning and how it not only lights up the sky, but it goes from east to west. And Christ uses that as an example for those that he's talking to, and for us also, that when he comes back, it's going to be known everywhere. Just as a lightning flash will light up the whole sky, it's going to happen when he returns. Verse 28, he goes on and he says, in this, right after what he talks about his second coming there, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. And mentioned last week, I mentioned again that some translations use the word eagle. I know the New King James that I usually do study in uses the word eagle for this verse instead of vultures. And I don't know if some of the other the NIV or NLT what they use. I should have looked that up, but the New American Standard uses the word vulture, and I think vulture is actually better. And explained that last week. I'll just briefly talk about that a little bit, just to kind of clarify where I'm coming from with this verse. This is a like a proverb that was used in this day. So it's something that the disciples would have been aware of. I don't think it caught them off guard. But the idea with a corpse is that there's always corruption. We're talking about something that's dead. And the quote here from one of the commentaries says, wherever there is spiritual corruption, judgment will follow. Wherever there is spiritual corruption, that judgment's going to follow. So we talked about this idea with vultures and with eagles, and not to get sidetracked, but we talked about they eat different food. They eat different food. Vultures are carrion birds. They eat dead things, whereas eagles, for the most part, are hunters. They find and eat fresh food. There may be some exceptions, but for the most part, by and large, vultures will find something dead and eat it, whereas eagles will find something fresh and eat it. That's one of the reasons that I like the idea of the word vulture instead of eagle, because we're talking about, in the verse, where the corpse is located. That's where the vultures are gonna come about. Um, this is I'm not necessarily agree with this quote from one of the common commentaries that I have, but this fellow says, just as when life has abandoned the body and it becomes a corpse, the vultures immediately swoop down upon it. So when the world has become rotten with evil, the Son of Man and his angels will come to execute divine judgment. So he uses it as an illustration of Christ's return. And I'm not so sure about that. Like I said, I don't necessarily go along with it. I just want to put this up there so you know that there are other interpretations of this. I like the idea of the vultures because we looked over in Revelation 19 last week. Remember, we read these verses, and just so you're tracking with where I'm at, in Revelation 19, verses 17 and 18, and then in verse 21, which is the last verse of the chapter, there's an angel standing as John's reporting this, of course, and he cries out with a loud voice to all the birds which fly in mid-heaven, "Come, assemble for the great supper of God, so that you may eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of commanders, the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of the horses and those that ride on them, and the flesh of all men, both free and slaves, small and great." And then the last verse in the chapter, "And the rest were killed with the sword which came from the mouth of him who sat on the horse, and all the birds were filled with their flesh." So I like this as a cross reference to verse 28. I think it's a very good cross reference. I believe that we're talking about the final battle at the end of the tribulation period, when all the armies of the world are assembled in the in the valley of Jezreel at the battle of Armageddon. There's going to be so much death and destruction there, and here this angel is calling the birds to come and feast on all this death that's there in this valley. So that's, again, that's not a hill I'm going to die on, but that's just kind of my take on it. Questions, comments?
That valley, you've seen it, right, Paul?
Yes.
The Valley of Megiddo. It's the only valley that is really large enough for all the armies of the world to maneuver. And at that time, in the Battle of Armageddon, all the armies of the world are going to come into the Valley of Megiddo, and they're going to be wiped out.
Yeah, yes, they are.
Literally wiped out. And yes, so this is why there's going to be so much dead meat there.
Yeah.
And these are going to be so much. It's going to be like I said, the great supper of God. They're calling all these vultures and carrion to eat all this carrion.
You folks were you through the Valley of Jezreel? Okay. It's a huge valley. I mentioned it last week. I mean, it's big enough for any armies that want to congregate there. And remember, they're coming to fight against God. Like, duh, but in verse 21, notice we're talking about the rider and this is the white horse. This is Christ on the white horse. This is not the white horse from Revelation 6. That's the Antichrist. He comes in peace, of course, and he does make peace with Israel. But this is at the end of the tribulation period, where Christ will return on a white horse. and he will lead his army. He doesn't even need an army, but he's going to have, I guess we're coming with him. Um, and they're coming. And notice what it says, that they're all killed with the sword that comes out of his mouth. And I mentioned last week, I believe it's just his word. I mean, all he's got to do is say a word, and just like that, tens of millions of individuals are going to be dead, just like that, instantly. Let's move on. Verses 29 through 31. As a matter of fact, let's have someone read those. It doesn't matter what translation you're in tonight. If you have, you should be in Matthew 24. If someone wants to read verses 29 through 31, we'll capture that and we'll look at the context. And
immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then a sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now learn this parable from the fig tree.
Nope. Stop right there. Don't go any further.
All right, okay, 31.
Don't give away my punchline, please.
Oh, gotcha.
I'll have to talk with you after class,
All right.
Okay. So here's a few things that Gary just read about that we're going to be looking at for a while. What's coming is darkness. Darkness is coming, and notice what Christ says. This is right between, I got to flip between two pages here. He says that the sun's going to be darkened, the moon's not going to give its light, the stars are going to fall from heaven, the powers of heaven are going to be shaken. So there's darkness that's coming upon the earth. It's a given. There's going to be so much darkness that there's not going to be anything to see. You have to remember at this point, and I think this gets overlooked sometimes when we talk about things like this. It's like, so they blot out the sun, and the Lord's going to blot out the moon. Well, we still have lights, don't we? This is at the end of the tribulation. The earth is in so much disarray. And we talk about the battles that are going to be taking place at this time, and there's all the talk about the horses that are involved. Folks, there ain't going to be no gasoline stations for them to fill their tanks and all that stuff. All that's going to be gone. The earth is going to be. Read Revelation 16. There's so much destruction on the earth. And it ends with an earthquake that is the worst in human history. And so, there's not going to be places where you can even get gas or oil or whatever. The whole earth is in disarray. And so when Christ talks about darkness, I think it's total darkness. I think it's that, and I'm sure we've all been in places or a room where it is actually pitch black. I don't know. It's been a long time since I've been to Ruby Falls, but I always remember when Jay and I were there. We were there on our honeymoon. That was a long time ago. Anyways, the one thing I always remember is that they turn the lights out. I don't know if they still do that. Maybe it's too scary or whatever, but it is absolutely totally black. It's so dark you can almost feel it. You ever had that feeling where the darkness almost encroaches on you? And that's the darkness that we're talking about here. The sun's blanked out. The moon is. The stars. Imagine looking up into the sky and not seeing any stars at all. We're fortunate here. When we lived in Phoenix, you were lucky if you could see stars in Phoenix. But up, like we're up on Lookout Mountain, and sometimes I'll get up in the middle of the night and look out the back door, and it's just amazing. The stars you can see. you won't be able to see any of that. Well, not us, but the earth dwellers that are living during this time won't be able to see anything. It's absolute blackness. Absolute blackness. The Old Testament speaks of darkness, and it uses very similar language to what Christ is using here in Matthew 24. And so what I want us to do is I want us to look at a few passages starting in Isaiah. And we're going to go from Isaiah, we're going to go forward. So this will be easy for everyone to find. So go back to the book of Isaiah to chapter 13. To chapter 13. And I'm just going to look at the one passage in Isaiah. I have chapter 34 up there also, but I just want to look at in chapter 13. Someone read verses 9 and 10, and wait until I get there. Okay, I'm ready. Isaiah chapter 13, verses 9 and 10.
See, the day of the Lord is coming, a cruel day with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land desolate and destroy the sinners within it. The stars of heaven and their constellations will not show their light. The rising sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light.
Okay, very similar to what Christ spoke of. Turn over to Ezekiel chapter 32. Go past Jeremiah, you'll be in Ezekiel. Go to chapter 32, if you would. In chapter 32 of Ezekiel, we want to look at just verse 7 before we move over to Joel. Ezekiel 32, verse 7. Someone want to read that for me, please?
When I blot you out, I will veil the heavens and darken the stars. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon will not give you its light.
Okay, go ahead and read verse 8.
Yes, I will bring darkness everywhere across your land. Even the brightest stars will become dark above you. I, the sovereign Lord, have spoken.
Okay, now I don't want to be accused of pulling something out of its context. So understand that this is spoken against Egypt. Okay, that's what this is about. But this goes beyond the scope of the judgment on Egypt. Okay, what we've just read here. I don't read anything in history or anything anywhere that talks about the sun being blotted out, the moon not being there, the stars. That's beyond the scope of the judgment that God is going to pour out on Egypt. Okay, so that happens in a lot of places like this, where the Lord actually kind of expands it, and we use the term double reference several weeks ago. I think in a lot of these cases it is double reference. It's referring to immediate judgment on Egypt, but it also projects to I think the tribulation period, because Christ is using almost the exact same language. Now, turn in to the right in your Bibles and show you an easy way to find Joel. If you're like me, I got to start in Daniel and just flip, because I can never keep these minor prophets. So you're going to go to Daniel, and then after Daniel comes Hosea, and then after Hosea is the book of Joel. Easy peasy, right? You're saying, I got these tabs here. I knew right where I was going, right? I see a lot of smiling out there, okay? Joel chapter 2. These are very interesting verses because Peter uses these verses, which we won't even go there, of course, but not tonight anyways. In Joel chapter 2, someone read verse 31. Verse 31.
The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord.
Okay, turn over one page. You should be in chapter 3. Look at verse 15. Verse 15. The sun and moon grow dark, and the stars lose their brightness. Okay, very similar language to what the Lord is using in Matthew 24. And if you turn one page, you're in the book of Amos. Isn't that great? So, turn to chapter 8 of Amos. And verse 9, have someone read verse 9 if they would. Amos chapter 8, verse 9.
And it shall come to pass in that day, says the Lord God, that I will make the sun go down at noon, and I will darken the earth in broad daylight.
Okay. Ooh, scary thought, isn't it? In the middle of the day. How many of you observed that eclipse? Was a few years ago. We drove all the ways to Blairsville so we could get a better view of it, and it was a total eclipse there. I mean, it was weird. I mean, an eclipse, it's dark, but it's not night. I mean, it was dark, but and it's the weirdest feeling, and chokes me up. Can you imagine what's going to happen here when in the middle of the day, it's not just going to be dusk, it's going to be total blackness. An interesting thing that I discovered is that scientists, you can see the information there, scientists have found the furthest distance that a human eye can detect candle light from a candle, is 1.6 miles. Okay, that's over 1.5 miles. With your naked eye, you can see a candle 1.5 miles in total blackness. Okay, that's I didn't realize. I'm thinking, maybe a couple hundred yards or whatever. But I was stunned because I followed up on several different pages to make sure that was true. But over 1.5 miles, you can see just a little flicker of a flame. Can you imagine what it's going to be like with the world in total darkness, and all of a sudden, in the midst of that, the glory of Christ makes its way into the world? Okay, verse 30 of Matthew 24. You can go back to Matthew 24 if you would. Okay, and then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. Okay, now picture that. Total blackness, and in the midst of that blackness, all of a sudden, if you've ever been, in a dark room trying to sleep, and someone turns the light on, I won't say who's done that, but it's like it wakes you up and like you don't know what's going on. I mean, you are like disoriented and everything. Can you imagine what's going to happen when the world, and we don't know how long this blackness is going to last, but all of a sudden from out of nowhere, as Christ said, I guess I should turn to the verses, huh? As Christ mentioned earlier with the lightning, all of a sudden it comes out of nowhere. The lightning comes out of nowhere and it lights up the whole sky. Can you imagine this happening? That, in the midst of this blackness, all of a sudden there's total, it's not just light, it's blinding light. It's blinding light. Now, there's a few words that I want us to look here. We're gonna talk about that word sign. That's a biggie, okay? In the Greek for this word, it can actually be translated a couple different ways. It can be translated as ensign or standard or flag. Okay, that's 3 different ways that this word, the Greek word, can be translated. And it's translated here in our Bibles, at least in this passage, as the word sign. So you can see at the bottom, this is a little historical fact, that when Israel would gather for battle, they would be called with the blowing of a ram's horn, and an ensign with a crosspiece on top, and an animal attached to it would be raised as a point of gathering. That's the idea of an ensign or a standard. Okay. Now I couldn't find something like this for for Israel, but I was able to find this for Rome, and everyone probably has seen these, if at least in the movies, if nothing else. Okay, um, these are ensign standard sign flags, excuse me, that the Romans used. And you can see on that right hand side that eagle. That's that cross piece. Don't think it's like a like a cross. It's just like a little piece that goes on top of the standard. And they would mount some kind of animal. Now the eagle, of course, was a symbol for Rome and for Rome's power. And that kind of comes into play with some interpretations of eagles gathering and all that stuff like that. But this is how the Romans, and I would imagine it was similar with the with the Israelites also. So the sign, could be several different things. There are a lot, especially in the early church fathers, that believed the sign that Christ spoke of was a cross that would come into play at the end, when that's the sign that the world should be looking for. Is the sign? It's the sign of the cross. Okay, that's kind of, there are probably still folks that hold to that. I'm not so sure about that one. This this cross in the sky is something that I maybe the Lord's going to prove me wrong. And I'll apologize to everyone in this class for it, but I don't see it being a cross. At the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, just outside of Rome, in I think it was like 317 A.D., when Constantine fought to become total ruler over the Roman Empire. He battled there, and the night before the battle, just a side note, the night before the battle, he said that he saw a sign in the sky, and that sign was a cross. He said he saw a cross emblazoned in the sky, and underneath the cross were these words: "In this sign, conquer." And Constantine is the one that legalized Christianity throughout the Roman Empire. Up to this point in Roman history, Christianity was outlawed for the most part, and he's the one, because he won the battle and became total emperor over all of the Roman Empire. But that's the only thing that I can find historically about and there's question as to whether it's true or if that's something that he made up. Yes.
Further research shows that cross that he allegedly saw in the sky was really an ankh, which is the circle over the cross.
Oh yeah, okay. That's an Egyptian thing, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So yes.
If you have a transition between two things, I have a question from Jeremy, from Joel online.
Oh well, let's hear Joel's question.
This goes back to the Battle of Armageddon.
Oh, okay.
A while back, he said that Paul Ben Ware said in his pamphlet that Armageddon is a series of battles. Can you explain that a little bit more?
I can only say this. Boy, this is tough. There are actually 8 phases. Okay, now stay with me on this. I can't go deep on this, at least now. But there are 8 phases to the Battle of Armageddon. And I'm not prepared, of course, at all to go into that tonight. But there are multiple battles that are taking place. Not all of them are going to be in the Valley of Jezreel. Okay, there's the battle that takes place in Basra and Petra. Christ is coming back to rescue his people. That's part of the Armageddon campaign. Okay, that's just one. There's the battle that takes place in Jerusalem. Again, that's part of the overall Battle of Armageddon. So there's 8 phases to this battle, and it's a good point that Joel brings out. It's a good question. The last one will be at the end where the armies are gathered in the valley of Jezreel for this battle against Christ and his forces. So good question. I don't know if that answers. We could spend several weeks just talking about the Battle of Armageddon, which I'd love to do, but time is short, as they say. Maybe we'll get to that when we get to part 3 or part 4. You never know. Let me move on. One of the best explanations, I think, and the one that I'm really kind of siding with tonight, is the one that I get from Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum. He says this about the sign, that the sign is, that's when the earth will be in total blackness, and suddenly that darkness is dispersed by the light of the Shekinah glory. The light will be followed by the return of the Messiah himself. And he goes on to say that the sign of the second coming would be the Shekinah light breaking through the worldwide blackout. To me, that makes more sense than anything else I've read. Okay, and I know there's other opinions out there about what the sign is. I mean, there's even a book out there called The Sign. I mean, you can go all kinds of places with this. What I'm trying to do is trying to keep this in line with what Christ says. There's going to be total blackness, and then the sign of the Son of Man is going to appear, and it's going to happen throughout the world. The whole world will see this sign. Now, what's the Shekinah glory? What is the Shekinah glory? Tell me, if those of you that know. Yeah, Wayne.
Well, it's similar to the glory that the priests experienced when they came into the temple, into Solomon's temple to dedicate it. It is a light, but I think it's more than light. I think it is the very essence of who God is.
Okay.
Coming through from the spiritual into the physical, and there is no darkness that can overcome it. That's similar to what's being talked about in John chapter 1.
Yeah.
The darkness is apprehended, comprehended it not, cannot overcome it. And that's, if one candle can be seen from a mile and a half away, think about the light and the glory of God.
Yeah, think of it. I mean, I think back to Moses up on Mount Sinai.
Right.
Right.
I
mean, when he came down, he was like, wasn't he glowing?
Yes.
I think it's from exposure to the Shekinah glory. I mean, not for too long. I mean, he'd be toast, literally. Yeah. But that's the kind of light that we're talking about. Yeah. The light that you think about in Sodom and Gomorrah, when the angels blind the entire. I mean, everyone in the city is after them pretty much, and they pull a lot in, and they basically blind everyone. Yeah. That may have been Shekinah glory, there also. I mean, it's something that we go from total darkness in verse 29 to this glory in verse 30 that the whole world is going to see. The coming of our Lord at the end of the tribulation to set up his kingdom for 1,000 years. That's what's coming. On the monument that's dedicated to the Reformation in Geneva, Switzerland, it is engraved on that monument, "After the darkness comes the light." Now think of the Reformation. The church had just come out of the medieval age, okay, where there was total blackness, darkness within the church. And the Reformation came along, and I certainly don't want to compare it to the Shekinah glory, but it's the closest example I can give, that broke through that darkness with the light of the glory of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the world has not been the same since then. It broke through that darkness. Now, looking in verse 30, then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. Why are they going to mourn? Why are they going to mourn? What do you think? Ideas? Let me know your ideas, and then I'll give you the answer. Okay. No, seriously. I mean, why do you think they're going to mourn? I mean, these are Christ's words. He says that all the tribes of the earth will mourn.
Well, they realize for the first time their lost connection.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Oh, Gary said that it's probably because they're realizing their lost condition. Okay, which is something to definitely think through, because also, you know, even in the midst of great joy, sometimes it can cause us to go in, I won't say a state of mourning, but it's just like heavy on us sometimes. I don't know if that's right. I don't know. The thing that puzzles me is that Christ says that all the tribes of the earth will mourn. Now, when the word is used in its plural, especially in the book of Revelation, it always refers to Gentiles and to Gentile nations. Okay? All the tribes of the earth. That phrase, when it's used in Revelation, always refers to the Gentiles. It's used in the Old Testament, but it usually has a modifier at the end where it'll say all the tribes of Israel, and then we know we're talking specifically about Israel. But there's also references to all the tribes of the earth or the world. So yeah, there's going to be mourning going on, and in we don't have to turn there, but just hit the wrong button. But this is where I want to be. Zechariah 12:10. Zechariah 12:10. Okay, they will look on me, whom they have pierced, and what will they do? They'll mourn. They'll mourn. They will look on me whom they have pierced, and they will mourn. This is the same verse that John quotes at the crucifixion in John 19. I have it up on the board if you want to make note of it. Okay? He uses the same verse, that they're going to look on me whom they have pierced. Okay? It's interesting because, in that happens every now and then, doesn't it? And I'm talking to a group that happens quite frequently, doesn't it? It was there and now it's gone, so I guess it's not that important. Lord doesn't want me to talk about it, okay? I'll tell you what, though. Hold your place here and go to the book of Revelation. Go to the book of Revelation, the first chapter. Chapter 1 of Revelation. Chapter 1 of Revelation. And we've got to look at this before we move on. In Revelation chapter 1, someone want to read verse 7. Revelation 1, verse 7.
Look, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the peoples of the earth will mourn because of him. So it shall be. Amen.
Okay. And it's almost identical, isn't it, to what Zechariah 12:10 says? Every eye is going to see the one that was pierced, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn over him. Okay? And this is right at the beginning of the book of Revelation. John's just, he's just getting his pen warmed up, and he writes this. He writes this. So we have Christ coming back. We have this darkness that precedes him. After this darkness comes this bright, what I'm calling the Shekinah glory of the Lord coming through the earth, lighting up the entire earth. Okay? There's no need for a sun anymore. Okay? His light will light up the earth. And then after that, he says that they're going to see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with power and great glory. Look at verse 31. Look at verse 31. This is kind of like, I don't want to say wrap up, but this is kind of like, just we're going to start summarizing here. Verse 31 of Matthew 24. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Some say from one end of the earth to the other. I think there's other probably translations that may put it a little bit better, but it's from everywhere. They're going to be gathered. His elect are going to be gathered. I'm calling your attention to this word here, gather. Gather. That is the Greek word episynago. It's the same word that's used. Now you're in chapter 24 here. Just look back at the end of chapter 23. In chapter 23, this is the same word that Christ uses in verse 37, where he laments over Jerusalem when he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets, stones those who sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together. That word gather, that's the same word that's used over here in verse 31. We get our English word synagogue from this Greek word. Synagogue, which is the idea of gathering. That's the idea behind the word synagogue, okay? And Christ is going to gather here in verse 31. Oops, wrong chapter. In verse 31, he's going to gather together his elect, but who's going to be doing the gathering? Angels, okay? More about that a little bit later, okay? More about that a little bit later.
Are these the raptured saints that are going to be gathered?
No, it's not. No, it's not, okay?
Well, who are these?
These are the elect that we've been talking about throughout chapter 24, which is the remnant of Israel. The believing of Israel who are scattered throughout the world at this point. Okay, the angels are going to be sent to gather them together, and they're going to be brought to the land of Israel. Okay, stay with me because we'll clarify this as we go. The one thing besides the idea of them being gathered, there's this idea of a trumpet, and I had to put this in here. The Lord can really afford more than one trumpet. I didn't know if you knew that or not. Okay, there's not just one trumpet. There are some people that try to say that there's only one trumpet. And the trumpet that's being blown here in verse 31 is the same trumpet that's being blown over in Revelation and in Corinthians and in Thessalonians when it talks about the rapture of the church. There are multiple trumpets, folks. And, what Dr. Constable says here, I'm having a hard time reading it on my laptop, so I'm going to read it from the screen. God summoned the Israelites to march into worship using trumpets, okay? During the wilderness wanderings and into the land. This is not the same trumpet that will call Christians to heaven at the rapture. Wherever you want to put the rapture, I don't care. Put it at the beginning, put it at the end, put it in the middle, do the 3/4 guy, whatever you want. Okay, there's going to be a trumpet blown, and the saints are going to rise. Okay, the church is going to rise. This trumpet that Christ is talking about in verse 31 is not that trumpet, folks. Some people try and make it out to be that trumpet. It is not that trumpet. Christ is calling his elect, and we've identified elect going back to verse, I think, 14 or so, as the saved remnant of Israel. That's the elect. That's the elect. I think we've shown that over and over. And so when this trumpet blows, Christ is releasing the angels to gather his elect and to bring them to Israel, which is where the millennial kingdom is going to be set up. This is the promised land. This is their land that they're going to have. He's going to gather them, starting with his angels, with a great trumpet, and they're going to be gathered together. They're going to be gathered together from one end of the sky to the other. Okay? From one end of the earth to the other end of the earth, from all over the world. And they're going to be gathered, and they're going to be brought into Israel. Turn back in your Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 30. Deuteronomy chapter 30. It's like, what are we going back there for? Well, we got to make a point. Okay? And this is the point. For the idea of gathering. In Deuteronomy chapter 30, we're just going to look at the first 4 verses. I only have verses 3 and 4 up on the screen, so if I get someone to read verses 1 and 2, Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 and 2.
When all these blessings and curses I have set before you come upon you, and you take them to heart wherever the Lord your God disperses you among the nations, and when you and your children return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart and with all your soul, according to everything I command you today.
Go ahead and read all 4 verses.
Then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you, and gather you again from all the nations where he scattered you. Even if you have been banished to the most distant land under the heavens, from there the Lord your God will gather you and bring you back.
Okay. He's going to gather and bring them back into the land. That will happen. When's it going to happen? It's going to happen at the end of the tribulation period. That's when the regathering of Israel will take place, the final regathering of Israel. Over, you don't have to turn there, put it up, it's up on the screen. Isaiah chapter 11 says this, verse 12. He will lift up a standard for the nations and assemble the banished, those that have been dispersed, the ones of Israel, and will gather the dispersed of Judah from where? From the 4 corners of the earth. So the Old Testament gives us indication that there's going to be a regathering. Okay? And it's going to be a regathering in faith. It's going to be a regathering in faith. Let me wrap up this section here by quoting again from Dr. Fruchtenbaum. He says this. Now we're talking about the Matthew passage. That's the passage we're looking at. Is a rather simple summary of all that the prophets had to say about the second facet of Israel's final restoration. Now hold on there, okay? He's saying that Matthew 24 is just a summary of, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Amos, Joel, all of them. It's all just it's a summary of those teachings. Okay? Its purpose was to make clear that the worldwide regathering predicted by the prophets will be fulfilled only after the second coming. So when Christ returns, his angels are going to be sent out to regather Israel and bring them back into their land, okay? Back into their land. Does that make sense? Or am I way off base and just like, I've never heard this before. Where are you getting this stuff? Something to think about if nothing else. Now keep in mind within the nation of Israel, okay, there is a believing remnant. Okay, please don't confuse this with the church. For whatever you look into this, don't confuse this with the church. Okay, there's a believing remnant within the nation of Israel. Okay, there always has been, and these are the elect that are going to be gathered according to Matthew 24, verse 31. That's the remnant that's going to be gathered and brought into the land. Well, what happens to those that didn't believe? Well, you'll have to come back for part 3 because he's going to explain in detail what's going to happen to those people, Jews and Gentiles, that do not believe or haven't believed. And that's why maybe there's this mourning going on when he returns. We know it's going to happen within the earth dwellers, the unbelieving Gentiles. Will there be unbelieving Jews? I think there might be. There When the millennium starts, and I have no problem saying this because I think Scripture backs it up. When the millennium starts, there will easy for me to say, there will be no unbelieving Jews in the nation of Israel. They will all be believers. There will be no unbelieving Gentiles in the millennium at the beginning of the millennium. Okay, keep that in mind. That's very important to understand. Okay, when we start the millennium for the 1,000-year reign of Christ, it's a clean slate almost. It's almost like after the flood of Noah, we start afresh. But it doesn't take long, does it? Didn't take them long. All they had to do was grow some grapes, and that was it. It was over. I want to talk just a little bit about the two gatherings of Israel. And I know I'm throwing a lot of, I'll probably put this in the handout for next week. But this chart comes from Dr. Randall Price, who I've quoted from. He does a lot of archaeological work. And his book is Jerusalem and Prophecy. That's where this comes from. Notice that there's two sides. There's the present, there's the permanent. Follow along with me, okay? The present is the regathering of Israel in 1948 when they got, when however it happened, UN and the whole 9 yards, whatever, they gave them the land. Okay, in the permanent side, that's the regathering that we just talked about. Okay, and on the present, the return is to part of the land. Israel does not have all of the land that was promised to them. Okay, they have a nice portion of it, but it goes. You have to remember the portion that God told, and He restates it over and over throughout Genesis. Goes from the Euphrates. That's what, Iran or Israel, Iraq, from the Euphrates all the ways to the Nile River. That is Israel's land. That's the land that God promised to them in the Abrahamic covenant. It was restated with Jacob and Isaac and on and on and on. Okay, it's a huge tract of land. It's a huge, huge piece of land. Right now, they have a part of it, and they're fighting over that. Right? I mean, we've talked about that in this class with the all that West Bank stuff that I don't even like to say. Okay. It's Samaria in Judah is what it should be called. Okay, they've returned in unbelief. Okay, now we want to support Israel and we want to help as much as we can with Israel, but we have to understand they are an unsaved or they've returned to the land in unbelief. Okay, does that mean we have nothing to do with them? No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is don't look at Israel and say they're God's chosen people. Well, let's clarify that. Okay. Let's make sure we get our ducks in a row when it comes to that statement. Okay, they are in the land and they're there for a reason. Okay, when they return to the land, when Christ comes back, they're going to return in faith, total faith. Okay, they're restored to the land only right now, but when Christ comes back, they get the land and they get the Lord. Okay, it's a package deal. You can't. It's both. They get both. Okay, finally. The present regathering of Israel that's in the land right now is setting the stage for the tribulation. Okay? It's setting the stage for the tribulation. They're going to be in discipline. Israel's going to be, and we've talked about the 7-year tribulation. Okay? That's for Israel. That's Israel's discipline is coming. Okay? When the millennium starts, right after the tribulation, okay, that regathering is going to set the stage for the millennium, and there will be blessings that go with that. Okay, all that makes sense. I can't believe I'm almost getting this done. Let me go on. Nice thing about this is it's all up on YouTube. You can see it again because it's just like I lost you about a half hour ago. Okay, verse 31 concludes with Christ answering the questions. You're in Matthew 24. Look at verses 1 through 3. 1 through 3. Remember the questions? Here's the questions. When will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? These are the questions that the disciples asked Christ and then he launches into this discourse through the rest of 24 and all of 25. Okay? But at this point, at verse 31, he has answered their two questions. Now, what's he going to do? I don't know, boy. He's got a lot of ink left here. What in the world is he going to be doing? Okay. Well, since he's answered their questions, now he's going to use parables. Oh, this is where it gets somewhat nasty because, oh boy, parables. What are we going to do with parables? Okay. But he's going to use parables to illustrate, to reinforce all that he's taught up to this point. Okay. That's important to keep in mind. That's why I can't rush through this the way I thought I originally could. There's just too much confusion out there, especially when we get to these parables. Last week, we saw two theologians quoting from Matthew 25 saying, Matthew 25 is all about social reform and helping our Christian brothers and all. Remember that? Well, I quoted those two individuals to you. Okay. So there's a lot of confusion out there. We've got to stay in context. We've got to stay in context. Okay. This is, believe it or not, my next to last verse. Yeah. Slide. been a rough night, you know. Okay. These are what are called, and that language is far too fancy for me to come up with. I would never call something like that, but thanks to Dr. Woods, where I got this slide from, he calls it 8 parabolic exhortations. In other words, there are 8 parables that Christ is going to give. Look at the verses at the top of the page there, starting in verse 32 of Matthew 24 and going to the end of Matthew 25. That is a lot of verses, and they're all parables. They are all parables. Okay, we'll get you probably this slide next week also. Okay, what we're going to do next week, and we're only probably going to be able to get to the parable of the fig tree, and Christ uses fig trees quite often to teach. This isn't the one that he curses and dies or whatever. This is an illustration that he's using, and keep this in mind if nothing else, that the parables from verse 32 of Matthew 24 through the end of chapter 25 are all about what he's just finished saying in those first 31 verses. Okay, he's building on that. And the parables become something that can be really tricky. So we need to be real careful about context. We need to be real careful about the wording. And so that's why, I'm only going to cover one parable in this session as we wrap it up. Because if you look, I know it's 8 o'clock, so just bear with me 1 second here. In Matthew 24, the parables, verse 32, and then look what happens in verse 34. Okay, this is just like a sneak. This is gotta hook you, right? I'm gonna hook you. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Boy, there's been a lot of ink spilt on that one, hasn't there? Let's find out what the generation is. Okay, within the context of what Christ has said. Okay, that's the key. That's the key. So I'm a minute over, but I went early a couple weeks ago, so I'm just recouping. Right? Any questions before we leave? Comments? I know it's like drinking from a fire hose sometimes, isn't it? You should be up here teaching it. Okay, let me close in the word of prayer, and then we'll let you all go. Thank you so much for your patience tonight.